Before the world started smoking meat low and slow, before hot chicken went global, before French fries got credited to Belgium, black hands built the techniques, planted the seeds, perfected the flavor, and watched the credit leave. Here are 30 African American foods the world copied but never gave us credit for. The pit, the smoke, the long, slow fire. Long before a barbecue became America's backyard ritual, it was the work of enslaved African Americans drawing on a tradition traced back to West Africa, where the Hausa had a word for the practice, babake, meaning to build a great fire and cook slowly over it. On the plantation, the most labor-intensive cooking was assigned to enslaved workers. They dug the pits, managed the coals, stayed up through the night turning the meat, and seasoned it with hot pepper and vinegar, a flavor profile rooted directly in West African cooking, where pepper sauces had been a staple for centuries. The slaveholder attended the feast. He didn't tend the fire. When the Great Migration carried black families north in the early 20th century, the pit masters brought their technique with them into Chicago, Kansas City, Detroit, where entire regional styles formed around their methods. Today, the word pit master is celebrated. The tradition it names, the unbroken line from West Africa to the American backyard, is still waiting for its full credit. For almost 70 years, Nashville hot chicken was a secret that belonged to one community. It lived on Jefferson Street in Nashville's black neighborhood, made and eaten by the people who invented it. The story goes back to the 1930s when a man named Thornton Prince came home late one too many times. His girlfriend loaded his fried chicken with so much cayenne it was meant as punishment. He loved it. He and his brothers perfected the recipe, opened a chicken shack on Jefferson Street, and for the next 7 decades, hot chicken stayed in the neighborhood that built it. Then it crept out. By the time KFC launched Nashville hot chicken nationally in 2016, food magazines were writing about it as if it had appeared from nowhere. Prince's Hot Chicken Shack, the original, still run by Thornton's great niece, Andre Prince Jeffries, got a footnote. 70 years of community, one national rollout. The name on the sign changed, and the story got shorter with every new franchise that opened. You have eaten thousands of them at diners, drive-thrus, restaurants, charging $14 for truffle versions. The French fry. What you may not know is who brought it to America. His name was James Hemings, and he was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. In 1784, Jefferson took Hemings to France to be trained in French cuisine. Hemings became the first American of any race to receive that training. He mastered pommes frites, the cream sauces, the technique. He brought it all back and ran the kitchen at Monticello and later the White House, serving the dishes he had learned, including what Jefferson's household records noted as French fries at a White House dinner in 1802. Jefferson is often credited with introducing them. Hemings negotiated his freedom in 1796, died in 1801, and appears as a footnote when he appears at all. He never saw his influence become a global industry. The fry survived. The name that made it did not. The word gumbo is not French. It is not Southern folklore. It comes from Ngombo, the Bantu word for okra, and okra is where the story begins. Some historians believe enslaved Africans carried okra seeds braided into their hair before the Middle Passage crossing, a form of preservation ensuring the food culture would survive. In West and Central Africa, okra had been a kitchen staple for centuries, thickening soups and feeding families. Once it arrived in the American South, it transformed the cuisine and then kept going. Okra spread into kitchens from Louisiana to the Carolinas, then across the Caribbean, then into South Asian and North African cooking, where it still appears without any acknowledgement of the West African tradition that cultivated and carried it here. Today, it shows up on farm-to-table menus, praised for its thickening properties and nutrition. The chefs who champion it rarely mention the women who carry its seeds braided into their hair so that something from home would survive the water. On Sunday mornings in the French Quarter, before the city woke, you could hear them, the challah women, moving through the streets with coal-heated braziers balanced on their heads. Challahs were small rice fritters, fried golden and dusted with powdered sugar, traced directly to West African food culture. When enslaved Africans were brought to Louisiana, they carried rice cultivation expertise without which the colony's rice economy could not have functioned. Provision of French colonial law, the Code Noir, prohibited enslavers from requiring work on Sundays. That day of rest became a lifeline. Black women used it to cook, sell, and earn. They became the challah women, feeding the city every Sunday morning, each fritter an unbroken connection to a continent taken from them. Challahs have nearly disappeared from New Orleans now. The beignet is on every corner. The challah is in the archives. The women who made them are not. The heat goes back thousands of years. Enslaved Africans had been cooking with hot peppers long before arriving in the Americas. The Malagueta pepper, native to West Africa, had been a trade commodity since the 15th century. When enslaved people in the American South were given the least desirable cuts of meat, the scraps the slaveholders' table refused, they did what their grandmothers had done across the ocean. They reached for pepper and vinegar. That combination became the foundational seasoning of the American South. It is the base note of every Carolina barbecue sauce. It is the logic behind every bottle of hot sauce from New Orleans to Nashville. Food historians trace the Louisiana vinegar and cayenne style, the one replicated in bottles sold globally, to the traditions of enslaved women on the Carolina coast in the 17th century. Today, hot sauce is a billion-dollar industry. Every bottle that pours from that tradition moves without a word on the label about who built the flavor first. In New Orleans, red beans on Monday was less a choice than a law of nature, beans soaked overnight. Sunday simmered all day Monday while the laundry ran. But the roots go deeper than convenience. West African rice and bean pairings came into Louisiana through the slave trade, and Haitian refugees arriving in the 1790s brought red kidney beans directly into the colony's food culture. Creole and Gula cooks refined it over generations into something that was at once African, Caribbean, and entirely its own. Louis Armstrong signed his letters, "Red beans and ricely yours," not as a joke, but as a declaration, a way of naming himself as a man of that kitchen and that tradition. When the dish traveled north with the Great Migration, it became a portable piece of home, a taste that said, without words, where you came from. Today, red beans and rice anchors Creole restaurant menus across the country. The credit usually reads a classic Louisiana Creole. The West African and Haitian traditions that built it appear in smaller print when they appear at all. The Gullah Geechee people who worked the rice fields along the South Carolina and Georgia coast were brought there because of what they knew. European colonists understood they could not cultivate Carolina gold rice without West African expertise, knowledge of how to flood the paddies, thresh the grain, and dry the harvest correctly, refined over generations in what is now Sierra Leone. So they forced those people here and used their knowledge to build an empire. On the margins of that labor, Gullah Geechee communities built their own table. They combined the grits ground from Native American corn with the shrimp the slaveholders considered too lowly to eat, calling it scrip and grits in their own language. What was discarded became a dish. By the early 20th century, Charleston cookbooks were publishing breakfast shrimp recipes without attribution. By the 1980s, shrimp and grits had become fine Southern dining. The dish became a Southern classic. The Gullah Geechee people who made it became a footnote when they were mentioned at all. She cooked them on a cast iron pan if she had it, the blade of a hoe if she was in the field. The name is literal, hoe cakes, made in the open because there was no kitchen. Enslaved Africans took corn-based cooking learned from Native American communities and remade it through the lens of a West African tradition, the flat, fire-cooked cake that had fed people for centuries before the crossing. The West African concept of fufu, the starchy side used to scoop and absorb a stew, translated onto American soil as the hoe cake, cornmeal and water, fire and patience. Through the 19th century and into the early 20th, hoe cakes fed Black Southern households, breakfast before the field, lunch at the community table. Then they were absorbed. Corn cakes, Johnny cakes, a rustic American classic served in farmhouse restaurants with no story attached. You can find them on brunch menus now. The woman who cooked them in the field without a pan has no name on the menu. The peanut arrived the way many things did, carried in the body when no other container could be trusted. Historians document that enslaved Africans braided seeds into their hair before the crossing, keeping plant knowledge alive. Across the Middle Passage, in West and Central Africa, peanuts had been a kitchen staple for generations, ground into soups, pressed for oil, carried as portable food. The Bantu word was nguba. In the Carolinas, it became goober. A colonial observer wrote in the early 1700s. The first I ever saw of these growing was the Negroes' plantation, who affirmed that they grew in great plenty in their country. Boiled peanuts, soft, salted, served warm, were part of the Gullah Geechee table, preserving the West African way of cooking the legume. They were the food of Black field workers, Black roadside vendors, Black family gatherings for 2 centuries along the Carolina coast. Today, South Carolina calls them the official state snack. They appear at tailgates and farmers markets as the most Southern thing you can eat. The plantation garden where the first ones grew is never mentioned. James Hemings did not just bring French fries home from Paris. He brought ice cream. He brought macaroni pie and creme brulee, an entire culinary vocabulary that reshaped what American dinner tables looked like. Trained in classical French cuisine in Paris in 1784, Hemings returned to Monticello and produced dishes no one in America had tasted. Jefferson served guests ice cream at state dinners and became known for refined taste. Hemings cooked those dinners, trained for years, and carried the knowledge across an ocean, and received no public credit during his lifetime. Jefferson recorded the recipes as his own preference, not his cook's creation. When Hemings died in 1801, 5 years after purchasing his own freedom, he left behind no cookbook, no monument. The ice cream recipe survived in Jefferson's notes. The man who made it is still being reintroduced to the country, 200 years later, one food history article at a time. Brunswick stew has 2 towns claiming it, Brunswick County, Virginia, and Brunswick, Georgia, each with a historical marker. Both credit white men. Both have a problem. The earliest named cook on record is an enslaved man. His name was Jimmy Matthews, and in 1828 he is credited in historical accounts as having made the first Brunswick stew, a long simmered combination of squirrel, butter beans, corn, and onion, over a hunting campfire in Brunswick County, Virginia. The dish spread into the wider culture the way so many things did, through the kitchens of enslaved cooks whose names never appeared at the events they fed. It became a staple of church suppers and political barbecues and spring fundraisers across the South, ladled from enormous pots into paper cups at parking lot events. Jimmy Matthews' name is not on either historical marker. The markers went up in the 1950s. He had been dead over 100 years. The stew he made is still being served in the county that erased him. Before it reached the fancy menus of Charleston restaurants, Carolina gold rice was grown in plantation gardens, tended by people who were not allowed to own the land they farmed. The crop that made South Carolina the wealthiest colony in North America by the mid-1700s could not have been cultivated without Gullah Geechee expertise. European colonists deliberately selected enslaved workers from what is now Sierra Leone because West African farmers had developed rice cultivation techniques over centuries: how to build earthen embankments to control flooding, how to read the tidal cycles, how to thresh the grain without damaging the hull. That knowledge was the engine of an entire colonial economy. When food historians Karen Hess and Jessica Harris documented this in the 1990s, they found the earliest written recipes for Carolina rice dishes in white-authored cookbooks. No mention of the community that grew the grain. Carolina gold rice has since been revived as a specialty crop, sold at farmers markets, and featured at acclaimed restaurants. The revival rarely names who planted the first field. Hoppin John is rice and field peas cooked together, a pairing originating in West African foodways where rice and legumes had been a foundational combination for centuries. In the South Carolina Lowcountry, enslaved Gullah Geechee communities ate it on New Year's Day to bring luck, a ritual food historian Jessica Harris traced to a Senegalese dish called tiebu niebe, rice cooked with black-eyed peas. The earliest written recipe appeared in an 1847 cookbook authored by a white woman from Charleston. The Gullah origin predates that book by generations. As black families from the Low Country moved north during the Great Migration, they carried Hoppin John with them, and the black-eyed peas found in northern cities gradually replaced the harder-to-find field peas of the original. Today, every New Year's Day, households across the South set a pot on the stove for good luck, repeating a ritual that came from Senegal. The word Gullah Geechee inspired appears on restaurant menus now, as if the tradition were a flavor note rather than a people. If you grew up in a Virginia household or spent time along the Carolina coast, somebody's grandmother made peanut soup, thick, rich, and tasting of something older than any recipe she kept. The groundnut stew that enslaved Africans carried from West Africa, where peanut-based soups had been part of daily cooking for generations, arrived in the American South as a kitchen staple long before it appeared in any cookbook. By the 18th century, peanut soup was appearing at Virginia gentry tables, quickly absorbed into white Southern cooking, praised in food writing, and eventually credited to traditional Virginia cuisine. Today, it appears on menus at colonial Williamsburg restaurants as a heritage Southern dish with roots described as African influence. The influence was not the vague, it had a name, a tradition, and a continent. The soup didn't drift up from nowhere. It crossed the threshold from the plantation garden to the dining room and left its original kitchen behind. Long before the soda fountain, before the can with the red logo, there was the kola nut, a bitter, stimulant-rich seed cultivated and traded across West and Central Africa for centuries. Historians record that enslaved Africans used kola nuts to filter and neutralize the foul water they were forced to drink during the Middle Passage. The nuts' chemical properties making undrinkable water survivable. By the 1880s, American pharmacists were experimenting with cola nut extract combined with other compounds to produce the first cola-flavored drinks. The cola nut became the cola in cola. The bitterness, the caffeine, the base stimulant note, the entire carbonated beverage industry was built on. Today, most cola recipes have replaced real cola nut extract with synthetic caffeine. But the flavor profile, the stimulant framework, and the very name of the drink trace directly back to a seed that enslaved Africans used to survive the crossing. The world drinks billions of cans of it every day. The can does not mention the Middle Passage. Most people outside of Black Southern and Appalachian communities have never heard of chow, a briny relish made from whatever vegetables remained in the garden at summer's end. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onion, bell pepper, hot pepper, vinegar, and sugar cooked down and sealed in jars for winter. Black Appalachian and Southern families have been making it for generations. A tradition food historians connect to both West African pickling practices and the necessity of preserving the harvest before it turned. Through the 1950s and 60s, chow appeared at every church, supper, and family reunion across Black Southern communities, spooned onto pinto beans alongside cornbread on top of hot dogs at summer cookouts. Today, it is sold in specialty food stores as Southern gourmet condiment, featured in food magazines as a rediscovered artisanal relish. The grandmother who put it up in mason jars every October is not on the label. The story starts in Central Africa in the tradition of eating the innards of animals, a practice refined over centuries long before any contact with the Americas. When enslaved Africans arrived in Texas, the slaveholders took the choice cuts and left the tripe. The people who received it did with it what their grandmothers had done with worse. They simmered it low and slow in a spiced broth until it was worth eating, then shared it communally. The dish crossed from Black Texas kitchens into Mexican-American foodways through the proximity of communities sharing the same geography and the same ingenuity. Today, Menudo is understood as a Mexican dish, served at weddings and Sunday mornings. From Los Angeles to San Antonio, its Central African and African American origins are rarely mentioned. Food historian Adrian Miller has documented this transfer, noting that the African tradition of preparing offal was the foundation on which the dish was built. The treep stayed, the credit moved in a different direction. You have probably seen the bean pie man at the corner near the mosque, outside the subway exit, beside the bus stop, bow tie, suit, cardboard box. Bean pie came out of the Nation of Islam's health teachings in the 1940s and 50s, promoted by Elijah Muhammad as an alternative to pork-heavy foods. The filling was navy beans, nutritious, cheap, available, sweetened and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg until it tasted like something between custard and sweet potato pie. It was sold on street corners in Black urban neighborhoods across Detroit, Chicago, New York, and Atlanta for decades, part of a Black Muslim economic network that operated quietly outside the mainstream food industry. Bean pie never made it to the supermarket shelf. It never got a cable cooking segment. It was never repackaged and sold at upscale bakeries under a different name, though it is exactly the kind of thing that would be if the right person had noticed it first. For now, it still belongs to the corner where you last saw it. After the greens came out of the pot, your grandmother did not pour the liquid down the drain. Nobody who knew anything poured it down the drain. Potlikker, the dark, mineral-rich, braising liquid left behind after a long, slow cook of collards or turnip greens with smoked meat, was the part of the meal that could not be wasted. Enslaved children were given it as a primary source of nutrition, the vitamins and iron The greens leached into the pot over hours of slow cooking. It was sipped from a cup, sopped up with cornbread, spooned over rice. Through the 1940s and 50s, in black Southern households, potlikker was as important as the greens themselves. You drank it at the table or carried a jar home from a neighbor who had made a particularly good pot. Today, it appears on upscale restaurant menus in small cups at $40 a bowl. The grandmothers who kept it from going down the drain are not on the tasting menu. The rib tip was not a prize cut. It was the cartilage-heavy scraps trimmed from pork ribs when butchers squared off a rack to create the neater St. Louis-style cut. By the 1950s, Chicago slaughterhouses were selling these trimmings in bulk for almost nothing. The black pit masters on the South Side, men who had brought barbecue technique north with the Great Migration and refined it over charcoal in the city's backlot restaurants, saw what everyone else had dismissed. Low and slow, the cartilage rendered, the fat softened, and the rib tip became something extraordinary. Chewy, smoky, dense, with a texture no other cut could produce. Restaurants like Lim's, Barbecue, and Argia B's built their reputations on the South Side serving rib tips through the 1960s. The cut spread outward from those kitchens and now appears on barbecue menus across the country. At chain restaurants that have never mentioned the South Side, the Great Migration, or the men who turned scraps into something worth driving across the city for. Wells Supper Club on 7th Avenue in Harlem became, by 1938, the late-night meeting point for jazz musicians coming off their last sets, men and women too wired to sleep, too hungry to wait, and too black to eat at most of the restaurants still open at 2 in the morning. What the kitchen had was chicken and waffles. The combination, savory and sweet, crispy and soft, everything your body needed after 4 hours of playing, became a ritual. The musicians who ate there brought it to every city they traveled, south and west, and it spread through black communities as a church supper tradition and Sunday afternoon staple. When Roscoe's House of Chicken and Waffles opened in Los Angeles in 1975, it formalized what had already been a decades-long black culinary practice. Today, chicken and waffles appears on brunch menus in Tokyo and London. Every restaurant that serves it descends from that kitchen on 7th Avenue, from those musicians who needed something at 2 in the morning in a city that had mostly closed its doors to them. The dish traveled everywhere. Wells Supper Club is not on the menu card anywhere. The dish that became a hallmark of Creole Sunday dining started in West Africa, in the jollof rice tradition that has fed the continent for centuries, a slow-cooked red rice seasoned with tomatoes and spices that traveled the Atlantic in the memory of people who had no choice about making the crossing. In the South Carolina Low Country, Gullah Geechee cooks adapted the tradition to local ingredients, tomato paste, long grain rice, and the seasoning knowledge carried across the water. The result was Charleston red rice, now considered so fundamentally Southern that it appears on heritage restaurant menus described as a product of low country tradition without naming the West African original. Jollof rice is having a moment on social media, debated by Nigerians and Ghanaians and Senegalese cooks in spirited arguments about whose version is superior. The argument is celebrated. The unbroken line between that dish and the bowl that sat on Gullah Geechee tables for centuries is almost never drawn. Abby Fisher did not set out to make history. She set out to share what she knew. In 1881 in San Francisco, she published What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, making it one of the oldest cookbooks authored by an African American on record. Fisher was born enslaved in South Carolina, and what she knew was the full architecture of the Gullah Geechee and Southern Black Kitchen, how to make gumbo, how to season a roast, how to put up preserves that would last a winter. The book contained 3 recipes for gumbo at a time when most of the country had never heard the word. Those recipes carried the full West African signature of the dish: okra as the primary thickener, a long simmer, the layering of flavors from a tradition older than Louisiana itself. Fisher's book was rediscovered by food historians in the late 20th century. By then, gumbo had been claimed by Cajun and Creole marketing for decades. Abby Fisher's name was not in the story. It is in the book. The book survived. In 1850, a man named Nearest Green was the most respected whiskey maker in Lincoln County, Tennessee. His enslavers hired him out to a preacher and distiller named Dan Call, who recognized what he had and told an orphaner boy named Jack Daniel, "Learn everything this man knows." The technique Nearest Green taught, sugar maple charcoal filtering, now called the Lincoln County process, is what distinguishes Tennessee whiskey from every other whiskey on earth. Some historians believe the method traces back to West African water purification practices that enslaved people carried to the Americas. After emancipation, Jack Daniel appointed Nearest Green his first master distiller. 7 generations of the Green family worked at that distillery. For over 150 years, Nearest Green's name was not in the story Jack Daniels told. In 2016, a New York Times article changed that. By then, billions of bottles had sold. The name on the label never changed. In Richmond, before the Civil War, there was a man named John Dabney who made the best mint julep anyone had ever tasted. He was enslaved but famous. The citizens of Richmond presented him with a silver cup engraved "Champion Julep." He used the earnings from his talent to buy his own freedom, then his wife's, then his son's. The mint julep Dabney perfected, bruised mint, sugar, bourbon, crushed ice, and an arrangement of fresh fruit and flowers, was being celebrated in Richmond journalism decades before the Kentucky Derby adopted the drink as its signature. Today, the mint julep belongs to Kentucky in every food history. Dabney's silver cup sits at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. The man who won it has been waiting a long time for the credit to follow. Lena Richard grew up in New Orleans, learned to cook in the homes of the families she worked for, and by 1939 had published a New Orleans cookbook, reclaiming what white food writers had spent decades erasing. White-authored Creole cookbooks of the early 20th century had systematically understated the role of Black cooks in building New Orleans cuisine, attributing the food to French and Spanish heritage, while the women who actually made it worked without credit. Richard's book named what she knew. A few years later, she became likely the first Black chef to host her own television cooking show in New Orleans, a local program in the late 1940s, years before the world had decided that a Black woman belonged on that kind of stage. Her cookbook went out of print. Her show was not syndicated. The gumbo and the rice and the slow-cooked traditions she described are on menus around the world. Her name is not. George Washington Carver arrived at Tuskegee in 1896 with a mission that had nothing to do with fame. The cotton monoculture had stripped the southern soil of its nitrogen. Poor Black farmers were working land that was dying. His answer was the sweet potato and the peanut, crops that restored nitrogen to the soil and fed families between cotton cycles. His 1922 bulletin documented over 100 uses for the sweet potato alone. His mobile Jessup wagon laboratory brought the knowledge to farms too far from any classroom. Thus, technique he promoted transformed Southern agriculture. Today, Carver is remembered mostly in connection with peanut butter, which he did not invent. The soil science that saved a generation of Black Southern farmers is the part that doesn't fit on the poster. There is a silence at the center of the watermelon story that most people never examine. The fruit is native to Southern Africa. Seeds have been found in the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. It came to the Americas through the slave trade, grown in plantation gardens by enslaved people as a food source and a source of water in summer heat. After emancipation, freed Black people sold watermelons from street carts, one of the few ways to generate income with almost nothing. That self-sufficiency, rooted in agricultural knowledge, tracing back centuries to the African continent, was then turned into a slur, deliberately weaponized in post-Reconstruction imagery to undermine Black freedom and dignity. The slur erased the history. The fruit became a punchline. The people who carried it across the ocean, who cultivated it, who fed their families with it, all of it buried under a joke that was never funny and was never meant to be. Edna Lewis grew up in Freetown, Virginia, a community founded after the Civil War by formerly enslaved people, including her own grandfather, who named the town for what they had finally become. She learned to cook there in a kitchen connected to something older, the seasonal rhythms of the Black Southern table, the spring greens and cured hams and layer cakes that belonged to a specific place and specific hands. When she published The Taste of Country Cooking in 1976, she was writing a preservation of a way of eating and a way of living she knew was already slipping. James Beard called her one of the great American cooks. Restaurants built menus around her ideas. Chefs trained on her pages. She became the standard. She died in 2006. The kitchens that carry her work forward are full of people who learned her techniques without ever learning where Freetown was or what it cost the people who built it.
You built it the night before. That was the rule. 7-layer salad showed up at every potluck and covered dish supper from about 1972 onward, always in a clear glass bowl so you could see every stripe, iceberg lettuce on the bottom, then frozen peas, diced celery, chopped onion, hard-boiled eggs, shredded cheddar, and crumbled bacon across the top. The dressing was the secret weapon, a thick coat of mayonnaise, sometimes sweetened with a spoonful of sugar, spread edge to edge like mortar. That mayo layer kept the air out and the crunch in. Every family had a variation. Some added water chestnuts for an unexpected snap. Others swore by Miracle Whip instead of Hemings and would argue about it until somebody changed the subject. The woman who brought it to the church supper carried it with both hands, walking slow because she knew that bowl was the first thing people reached for. Peach and cornbread pudding was a layered dessert that brought together juicy fresh peaches and moist, crumbly cornbread soaked in a sweet custard. This dish capitalized on the abundance of peaches during harvest season and the staple nature of cornbread in Southern kitchens. Home cooks layered slices of cornbread with peeled, sliced peaches before pouring a creamy mixture of eggs, milk, and sugar over the top. The pudding was then baked until golden and set, producing a warm, comforting dessert that balanced fruity sweetness with a buttery texture. This recipe represented a resourceful use of pantry staples and seasonal fruits, turning simple ingredients into a memorable treat. It was often served at family dinners and church socials, embodying both hospitality and tradition. The combination of fruit and cornbread made it a unique contribution to African American culinary heritage, showcasing creativity in desserts. Today, it remains a nostalgic favorite that connects modern palates to classic Southern flavors. The pop of hot oil told you dinner was close. Salmon croquettes came together fast, a can of pink salmon drained and flaked with a fork, mixed with crushed saltine crackers, an egg, and whatever else she felt like adding. In the South, families ate them once a month, usually on a Friday, alongside soup beans and cornbread. Southern Black families called them croquettes and fried them in a well-seasoned skillet. Jewish grandmothers shaped them with matzah meal and served them cold the next day. Appalachian households used the bones and all. Kids grew up loving the crunch. Canned salmon from Alaska cost less than $1, and stretched into 6 or 8 golden patties depending on how many mouths were at the table. Nobody followed a recipe. You watched, you learned, and when the color looked right, you flipped. She could tell by the sound of the oil whether the pan was ready. That ear, that instinct, it vanished when she did. Molasses glazed ham combined the sweet, robust flavor of molasses with savory ham to create an economical yet indulgent dish common in mid-century Southern kitchens. This recipe made use of affordable ham cuts, often shoulder or picnic hams, which were slow-cooked and then brushed generously with a sticky molasses glaze. The glaze caramelized in the oven, infusing the meat with rich sweetness, balanced by a hint of saltiness. Molasses was a staple sweetener in African American households, valued for its deep flavor and affordability compared to refined sugar. The dish was a centerpiece at family gatherings and holiday meals, symbolizing both celebration and resourcefulness. Cooking ham with molasses allowed cooks to stretch ingredients while still producing a dish that felt special and satisfying. Though less common today, this recipe reflects a culinary heritage of making the most out of pantry staples while honoring flavor. Its lingering aroma and rich taste evoke memories of home kitchens filled with warmth and tradition. She greased the cast iron skillet first, then packed the bottom with brown sugar and lined it with canned Dole pineapple rings, a bright red maraschino cherry tucked into each center. Pineapple upside-down cake had been around for decades, but the 1970s made it a fixture at church socials, birthday parties, and any gathering where a woman wanted to prove she could bake. The batter went right on top of the fruit, plain yellow cake, nothing fancy, and the skillet slid into the oven. The magic happened at the flip. That caramelized sugar pulled away from the pan in a sticky golden sheet, and the pineapple rings sat on top like little crowns. A box of cake mix, a can of fruit, and brown sugar from the mason jar on the counter. The whole thing cost next to nothing. Your grandmother knew the exact moment to turn it. Too soon and the sugar stuck. Too late and it burned. She never set a timer. When she stopped making it, nobody else could get the flip right. Spiced sweet potato biscuits were fluffy, tender biscuits made by incorporating mashed sweet potatoes and warm spices into classic biscuit dough. This recipe blended the natural sweetness of the potatoes with cinnamon, nutmeg, or allspice to create a flavorful breakfast or side dish unique to African American kitchens. The biscuits were often served alongside savory dishes or enjoyed with butter and honey for a comforting start to the day. Sweet potatoes were a staple crop in the South, prized for their nutrition and versatility, and incorporating them into biscuits was a way to add moisture and flavor while stretching ingredients. The warm spices lent a cozy aroma and taste reminiscent of home cooking and seasonal celebrations. These biscuits showcase the creativity and love embedded in traditional baking, transforming simple pantry items into something special. The recipe remains a treasured link to culinary heritage and continues to inspire modern variations that honor its roots. If the croquettes fed the family on a weeknight, this fed the holiday table in 5 minutes flat. Watergate salad had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the fact that Kraft released pistachio pudding mix in 1975. Somebody figured out you could stir it into crushed pineapple, miniature marshmallows, and Cool Whip and call it done. Kraft originally named it Pistachio Pineapple Delight, but after a Chicago food editor renamed it during the scandal, the company never fought it. The dish spread through church cookbooks and junior league collections faster than any casserole that decade. Bright green, impossibly sweet, and requiring zero cooking skill. It was the dessert that busy mothers made when they had 15 minutes between carpool and dinner. 5 ingredients, no oven, no stovetop. You didn't even need measuring cups if you eyeballed the Cool Whip. That kind of simple barely exists anymore, not because the recipe is hard, but because the women who made it without thinking twice are harder to find every year. Brown sugar-baked beans were a hearty side dish, featuring slow-cooked beans sweetened with brown sugar and seasoned with spices to create a rich, comforting flavor. This recipe was a common accompaniment at family gatherings, barbecues, and everyday meals, highlighting beans as a nutritious and affordable protein source. The beans were simmered gently with molasses or brown sugar, onions, and sometimes bacon or ham hocks for added depth. The sweetness balanced the earthiness of the beans, making the dish both filling and flavorful. Rooted in Southern cooking traditions, brown sugar-baked beans reflected the importance of beans in African American diets and the ingenuity in seasoning them with pantry staples. Cooking the beans low and slow allowed flavors to meld, producing a dish that could feed large families economically. This recipe also symbolized communal meals and celebrations, where food brought people together around the table. It remains a beloved comfort food with strong ties to cultural identity.
The credit went elsewhere. If that matters to you, subscribe and share. That is how the record gets set straight.